And I will just introduce the panelists that you see on your screen. We'll do a formal introduction later. But I'm going to ask the individuals to just nod as your name is called. I don't know with the reverse imaging what direction we will be. So we have Dr. Nora Desis, Dr. Shweta Vinayak, yes, Bridget Hempstead, and we have Glorianne Jackson, and we have Marilyn Lacey, and we have Dr. Kieran Dillon, and I am Dr. Raymonda Johnson. So it is 6:01, and we will establish the official beginning now, and we will begin with Marilyn greeting.
Well, good evening. I am Marilyn Lacey, and on behalf of the Akarama Foundation Incorporated of Theta Omega Chapter and the Monarch Awards Foundation Incorporated of Xi Nu Omega Chapter, Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated, we welcome you to an enlightening session with primary researchers from the Cancer Vaccine Institute at the University of Washington. This is a very special program because most of us on this webinar will experience two firsts this evening. As individuals and organizations, we have supported cancer research for years, but this is probably the first time you will interact directly with actual researchers discussing their work. Secondly, we all know that women and Black and Brown people in the United States historically have been underrepresented during the development of drugs, treatments, and medical products. Well, this evening, we are being asked to assist with outreach to diverse communities, which is important for so many reasons. During this presentation, you are bound to hear information that is new to you, and we promise to save time at the end to address your questions. So have some note paper and a pen ready so that you can keep track of those questions until the end. Now, Dr. Raymonda Johnson will continue with a brief background on how this presentation came to be.
Thank you, Marilyn, and greetings to everyone. The idea of this webinar is the result of discussions between my son, Teddy Johnson, and the researchers in the Cancer Vaccine Institute at the University of Washington, UW. Teddy is clinical associate professor in the UW School of Pharmacy, and he is director of technology development at the Institute of Translational Health Sciences, ITHS. It was through ITHS that he connected with the Cancer Vaccine Institute, CVI. In those discussions, the CVI researchers expressed concern about the difficulty of connecting with broadly diverse populations to participate in their studies. Now, having lived his entire life with me and my sisters, all members of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated, Teddy knew exactly how to reach the population they needed. He called his mom, and I called my sisters, and we called our chapter foundations. I am a member of Theta Omega Chapter and Akarama Foundation Incorporated. Marilyn is a member of Xi Nu Omega Chapter and the Monarch Awards Foundation Incorporated. And Glorianne is a general member with connections to several community, national, and international organizations. Our chapter foundations agreed to present this webinar in order to share this exciting information. I will return as moderator of these proceedings, but now, to address the broad goal of the webinar, I want to introduce Glorianne Jackson.
Thank you, Ramonda, and hello, everyone. Since joining URAY in Beta Chapter Service some 60 plus years ago, I have had many opportunities to work with various organizations and programs, and a lot of sprinkling of one-on-one interaction also. So I feel very comfortable here asking each person on this webinar to listen well with intent to share the information about the Cancer Vaccine Institute. For some of you, what we learned today will bring comfort, and I invite you all to become advocates of spreading the word about this extraordinary work. Hopefully, our conversation will inspire new and more open communication among people who are interested, just concerned, or already in some stage of illness or recovery. Perhaps this is our opportunity to bring more cancer conversation out of the closet. We all know people who have been touched by cancer, family, friends, coworkers, members of clubs or organizations. It is vitally important that we reach out to more people of color, especially African Americans, in our broader communities across all sectors of our economic, social, and cultural lives. So following this evening's presentation, we may all, I hope, challenge ourselves to share this valuable information that is bringing better health and new hope to many lives. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Glorianne, for emphasizing our individual responsibilities. Now let us turn to the experts. As a reminder to everyone, please jot down your questions or put them in the chat box as we proceed. Also, please indicate the city where you're calling from. Now to introduce Dr. Nora Disis. Dr. Disis is a professor of medicine and adjunct professor of pathology and obstetrics and gynecology at UW. She is a member of the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center, FHCRC, and Associate Dean for Translational Science in the UW School of Medicine. She received her MD from the University of Nebraska Medical School and completed a residency and chief residency in internal medicine at the University of Illinois, Chicago. She completed her fellowship in oncology at UW FHCRC. Dr. Disis is an expert in breast and ovarian cancer immunology and translational research. She is a pioneer in cancer research. Dr. Disis is a member of Alpha Omega Alpha and the American Society of Clinical Investigation. She is the editor-in-chief for JAMA Oncology. She is also a member of several committees and task forces for both the American Society of Clinical Oncology and the American Association for Cancer Research. At UW, she is director of ITHS and director for CVI. Here to present the promise of cancer vaccines is Dr. Nora Disis.
Thank you very much, Dr. Johnson. If you'll allow me, I'll share my screen and show some slides. Here we go. All right. Can everyone see the slides?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, today we're going to talk a little bit about vaccines to treat and prevent cancer. We've all heard of vaccines, but it isn't often we sit and think that vaccines really are the one modality outside of figuring out how to get clean water that have had such a profound impact on public health. In fact, within the last generation, we used to only live to be about 60 years old. And that was because people would die of infections early on in their lives. But if you look at this slide, which was generated by the Center of Disease Control, over the last many decades that vaccines have been available and implemented, we've almost eradicated those diseases that used to kill us long ago. And in fact, if everyone would receive a vaccine, we would eradicate these diseases. Nothing has shown us more of the power of vaccines than the COVID pandemic in terms of being able to make a vaccine quickly and get immunized against a pathogen that was really taking many people's lives. Now, whereas we've had tremendous success with vaccines in infectious disease, we've lagged a little bit behind where cancer was concerned. But our goal here at the Cancer Vaccine Institute is to develop vaccines to train the immune system to recognize cancer cells as dangerous and eliminate them, much as infectious disease vaccines recognize pathogens in the body and eliminate them. And in fact, we have a cancer vaccine moonshot underway. We're making vaccines for both treatment and prevention for colon cancer, bladder cancer, prostate cancer, ovary cancer, lung cancer, and breast cancer. Now, you might say, why these cancers? Because they are responsible for 50% of all the cancers diagnosed in the US and 50% of all the cancer deaths in the US per year. Some of our programs are quite advanced. I'll show you some data in lung and breast cancer, and some are quite nascent, still in preclinical development, but we hope to get colon, bladder, and prostate vaccines into clinical trials within the next 2 years. So what makes us say that we have a moonshot, or what makes us feel that cancer vaccines, the time has come? I can honestly say we are at a tipping point for cancer vaccines. This is why you're reading so much about them in the newspaper almost every week. And that tipping point has occurred because of 3 things. The first thing is we now know the type of immune response we need to kill cancer. And it's not the type of immune response that's generated by an infectious disease vaccine. Most of those vaccines generate antibodies because those can circulate in the blood cell and grab onto in the blood and grab onto the pathogen. For cancer, we need to generate a T cell response, the type of response that can kill a pathogen like a virus that has gotten inside the cell. So we know the right type of immune response we need to kill cancer. The second thing is we now know what parts of cancer can stimulate the immune system. We know the antigens or immunogenic proteins that we can put into a cancer vaccine to direct the immune system to those proteins. In fact, we know thousands of immunogenic proteins in cancer. And the final thing that brings us to a tipping point for cancer vaccines are these new vaccine technologies that make immunization much more effective. And these technologies are nucleic acid-based technologies, RNA vaccines, such as you've seen with COVID, and DNA vaccines. These are the types that we use. Now, why are these so much more effective? because these vaccines actually inject the antigen into a cell in your body and allow that cell to chop up and process that immunogenic protein the way your immune system wants to see it. It's a very personalized way of delivering a vaccine, and it allows anyone to make an immune response to those antigens that are involved in the vaccine. And the nucleic acids themselves are highly immune stimulatory, so they give that immune response an extra boost. So when I say the immune system needs the right type of immune response to respond to cancer, we generally talk about T lymphocytes in two different flavors. The first is a type 1 T cell or type 1 immune response. And you can see that here on the left-hand part of the slide. These T cells, CD8 T cells and CD4 T cells, secrete cytokines that are highly inflammatory. And in fact, CD8 T cells are also called killer T cells. And these T cells can actually kill cells that are expressing the antigen or immunogenic protein. This is the type of immune response needed to kill cancer because it's tissue destructive and inflammatory. Now, the other type of immune response is called a type 2 response. And this immune response consists of B cells, which make antibodies, and regulatory cells. These regulatory T lymphocytes turn off type 1 T cells. These regulatory T cells are anti-inflammatory. The immune response generated here would promote cancer growth. So we have an inflammatory and an anti-inflammatory immune response. Now, what has really tipped cancer vaccines over for us is technology development. And we've developed technologies that allow us to rapidly make vaccines that elicit a strong anti-cancer response. This technology allows us to use genomic sequencing, which is widely available, literally hundreds and hundreds of data sets to identify proteins that are the cancer drivers for any particular disease. Now, we don't know what causes an individual cancer, but we do have a very good handle on what makes some types of cancers grow. And so literally, if you could remove those proteins from the cancer or eliminate cells that had upregulated those cancer drivers, you could potentially eliminate cancer. The second break in technology is we've developed artificial intelligence that allows us to identify segments from these immunogenic proteins or antigens that selectively elicit either a type 1 inflammatory response or a type 2 anti-inflammatory response. And this allows us to make a barcode for an effective cancer vaccine. So we can take an individual antigen, predict those segments, remove all the regulatory segments, so we only have those segments which will elicit an inflammatory response, and then we can create a multi-antigen cancer vaccine, and we've been making vaccines for both prevention and treatment, and I'll show you a few examples. So we're developing nucleic acid-based vaccines to treat cancer in patients who have existing cancer, to prevent cancer from coming back, which is a major problem for many cancers. And finally, our newest avenue is to prevent cancer from occurring in the first place. So I'd like to show you 3 examples. This first example is a vaccine targeting the HER2/neu intracellular domain protein. It's part of the HER2/neu protein, which is responsible for causing about 30% of all breast cancers. And this vaccine was designed to prevent breast cancer recurrence. In a normal cell, you have low levels of HER2/neu, but when breast cancer arises, those breast cancer cells express extremely high levels of HER2/neu, and this is what makes HER2/neu immunogenic. So we did just what I talked about. We predicted segments that were highly inflammatory, directed from the HER2/neu intracellular domain protein. We put them into a DNA vaccine, and we ran a very large phase 1 clinical trial. This was a phase 1 dose study looking at 3 doses of this HER2/neu ICD vaccine in 66 patients with stage 3 and 4 HER2/neu positive breast cancer. The patients were treated to a complete response. They have a very high likelihood of recurrence, or they had bone-only disease, and the vaccine was given 3 times, 1 month apart. Now, the one thing I can tell you about this HER2/neu ICD vaccine and most of the vaccines that we've tested is that they're very safe. In fact, with the study I'm showing you now, we've followed our patients for over 10 years after vaccination to monitor side effects. This is because this HER2 ICD vaccine was one of the first DNA vaccines to go into clinical trial. 98% of women had very minor side effects that are similar to the flu or what you would see when you get the COVID vaccine, and they resolved within a few days. And these results, 98% having very mild effects, are really similar with all our vaccines. Now, the HER2/neu vaccine was able to elicit a very strong immune response, and it appears to be effective. All 3 vaccine doses tested could stimulate immunity. The middle dose, which is in the red, 100 microgram, was the most effective in that it generated immune responses at a high level in the majority of patients. And importantly, those immune responses persisted for more than a year without any boosters. In fact, over 80% of the patients are still alive 10 years after vaccination. And we haven't reached our median progression-free survival. So many of them have not progressed their disease. Even with the less effective doses, the 10 microgram and 500 microgram, we still have 70% of these advanced stage breast cancer patients alive 10 years after vaccination. So this vaccine now is in a very large randomized clinical trial. It's in patients who have HER2 low breast cancer. This is a new form of triple negative breast cancer. We're looking to enroll about 150 patients. So anyone who's had triple negative breast cancer and is about to undergo treatment for it, we would love to hear from them in terms of seeing whether they'd be interested in eventually getting this vaccine. Our next vaccine was really designed to prevent cancer from developing. And this is a vaccine called StemVac, and it's targeting cancer stem cells. Now, why would we try to eliminate cancer stem cells to prevent cancer? That's because cancer stem cells arise very early as the tumor develops, and these cells are resistant to therapy. They are the ones most likely to lead recurrence, and they have very early metastatic potential. So we use the technology that I described to identify 5 stem cell proteins and the highly inflammatory segments from those proteins that could be manufactured into a vaccine. And this last panel here is an example of a study in transgenic mice. These are mice that were genetically engineered to develop breast cancer at about 100 days of life. And you can see those that were immunized with StemVac, over 50% of them never developed cancer. Now, we hope that StemVac would be a vaccine that could go into patients who are at a genetic high risk for developing breast cancer, such as BRCA1 or BRCA2 gene carriers, or women who have other types of genetic abnormalities that really predispose them to developing breast cancer. And we think that immunization with StemVac, since those genetically predisposed tumors have a tendency to be highly STEMmy, might be a way to add to their ability to fight the development of cancer. So we've done a phase 1 clinical trial of StemVac, again in more advanced stage breast cancer patients. Of course, these are women who do have high levels of breast cancer stem cells, since many of them have already recurred their disease, to test the vaccine's safety. We did a phase 1 dose escalation, 3 doses of the vaccine. This time we immunized patients with hormone receptor positive cancer or triple negative breast cancer. We immunized 30 patients, 10 per dose, 3 vaccines 1 month apart. But we also did boosters at 3 and 9 months, much like the COVID vaccine. We detected an immune response to all 5 of the stem cell proteins. And interestingly, the intermediate dose was also the most immunogenic dose. It was very important to get the boosters because they really increased the level of response. And you can see that the patients developed very high levels of StemVac immunity. And those that responded, their immune responses were 500-fold at a median over baseline. Here you can see in arm 2, after the boosters, we only had 1 patient not respond to the StemVac vaccine. So this vaccine is moving ahead into clinical trials. We have a large phase 2 trial in patients with non-metastatic triple negative breast cancer, again, to see whether we can prevent disease recurrence. And since non-small cell lung cancer is a very STEM-oriented cancer, we have a therapeutic trial adding StemVac to other immunotherapy drugs to see if we could push more patients into a complete remission with non-small cell lung cancer. But you can see vaccines such as StemVac might work with a number of cancers that are associated with high levels of cancer stem cells. The final example I want to show you is kind of flipping and using those segments from antigenic proteins that cause an anti-inflammatory response. Now, why would we want to do that? Since I said earlier, anti-inflammatory T cells might promote tumor growth. Well, one of the things we now know is that inflammatory states, chronic inflammatory states, can predispose to the development of cancer. And one of a very common inflammatory state we're just understanding now is inflammation from fat cells, adipocytes that have become expanded in obesity. They become highly inflamed and they lead to metabolic syndrome, which helps to cause diabetes and hypertension. And we know people with obesity, especially this inflammatory obesity, are at a higher risk for the development of breast cancer, prostate cancer, colon cancer, liver cancer, a multitude of cancers compared to people who are normal weight. Now, someone might say, well, why don't you just tell people to lose weight? We all know it's not that easy. But more importantly, this inflammatory response is due to T cells that have been vaccinated against the fat by this inflammatory state developing. So even if these people could lose the weight, they will not lose the inflammation. So our hypothesis was we could develop a vaccine directed against antigens expressed in fat, in inflammatory fat, and using our technology choose, instead of the inflammatory segments, the anti-inflammatory segments, create a vaccine, and potentially prevent the development of breast cancer and reverse metabolic syndrome like diabetes and hypertension. So we created a vaccine. It's called AdVac, adipocyte-directed vaccination. It's a DNA vaccine, and it targets proteins associated with fat cell inflammation. This is in preclinical studies, so we haven't tried it in people yet, but I can show you what's going on in mice. And we think AdVac shows promising results in mouse studies. Here you see in the far panel, these are mice that were made obese. They got a Western diet full of fat, and at the time they became obese compared to their litter mates, we began to give them AdVac. And here's AdVac immunized mice in the gray, and control animals that just were obese and got a sham vaccination. And here you can see in a glucose tolerance test that AdVac is correcting their blood sugar just by reducing the inflammation. When we look at their fat cells, one of the cells, those CD8 T cells, those type 1 T cells, they're very responsible for causing the inflammation that's associated with this metabolic disruption. And here you can see the animals that were immunized with AdVac. When we look at their fat, they have a markedly reduced level of these inflammatory immune cells. And finally, most importantly, when we take our mouse model, the transgenic model that are destined to develop breast cancer, and we make them obese, their cancers come up more quickly and they're much more aggressive. But just giving AdVac, again, at the time they become obese, will prevent 60% of the mice from developing breast cancer. And we believe this is the first vaccine developed to lower the risk of breast cancer in patients who have inflammatory obesity. So we feel we're developing a library of effective vaccines for multiple cancers. Our breast cancer, ovarian, and lung cancer vaccines are well on their way and advancing in phase 2 studies. We have more vaccines down the pipeline. And even though technology has advanced to allow us to do this very quickly, the one place we've always needed help is people willing to volunteer for these phase 1 and phase 2 clinical trials. And we feel vaccines in particular would be appealing to patients because the vaccines have the potential to eliminate the threat from cancer really at the single cell level with very few side effects, because the immune system is extremely specific for its target, those immunogenic proteins or antigens. We also feel that the patients who enroll in our trials often tell us they enjoy the break from chemotherapy, that the vaccines are easy to take, and some do seem to be deriving benefit. This is one of our patients who said, I participated in the HER2 trials 5 years ago, just to let you know that I'm doing great. A lot of living in the past 5 years. Both my parents have passed and both my children have gotten married. 3 grandsons born, twins too, as you can see. I think often of the trials and how grateful I am that I qualified and was able to benefit so much from the program. And we're hoping that if we can get the word out that there are clinical trials you can participate in that don't have some of the side effects and may have benefit, not only ours, but many of the new immune therapy trials that are coming down the pipeline, that patients would be interested and potentially it would be something that they'd like to do. So I'd like to end with a very important slide. These are the members of our Cancer Vaccine Institute here in Seattle. You know, it really is team science that can take an idea from someone's mind to a clinical trial, and we'd never be able to do what we do without the participation of every team member in the CVI. And if you'd like to learn more about our clinical trials or just about our group, Our website is right down here, uwcvi.org. All our phone numbers are on there and all our emails. Please feel free to contact us. So with that, I'll turn the slides back to the moderator, Dr. Johnson.
Very good. Thank you very much. That was very inspiring information. So let's move now to a discussion of the importance of clinical trials. Dr. Shweta Vinayak is an assistant professor in the Division of Oncology at UW and an assistant member of the Clinical Research Division at the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center. She received her medical degree from Virginia Commonwealth University School of Medicine and her master's degree in physiology and biophysics from Georgetown University. She trained as a resident in internal medicine at Montefiore Medical Center at Albert Einstein College of Medicine in New York. She completed her fellowship in medical oncology at Stanford University. At UW, Dr. Vinayak serves as Director of Clinical Trials at the CVI. So to discuss the importance of clinical trials, please welcome Dr. Shweta Vinayak. Dr. Vinayak, are you muted or?
Hello. Hi, everyone. Thank you for that very kind introduction, Ramonda. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes, we're good.
Okay. And can everyone see my slides?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So I will talk about clinical trials in general. Dr. Deasis introduced several important clinical trials that we're doing within our group, but I will talk about clinical trials in general and why they're important. So we will focus primarily on cancer clinical trials. Clinical trials are basically research studies to test new ways of treating cancer. We determine or we try to figure out if the new intervention or the new drug or device is safe, if it works better or has fewer side effects compared to the existing treatments. And the way we think about clinical trials is all of our current standard of care treatments that exist today and we're using in patients in the clinic were a clinical trial of the past. And this is really how we make progress in cancer treatment. Glorianne and others mentioned that, you know, many of our lives are touched by cancer, and we know we're not done yet. We know we need to go a long ways in improving our treatments, whether it's for quality of life or whether, you know, we can figure out how to make our existing treatments better. For many reasons, this is why we do clinical trials. It takes many years to design clinical trials. Dr. Deasis showed a lot of work in a short number of slides, but you know, many of the vaccine developments is, you know, decades of work, many people working on it. And when we get past those mice studies and get into human trials, it takes many years to design that trial and to activate it. And I'll touch base later on that there are many regulatory processes that exist for patient protection and safety, all for very, very good reasons. So clinical trials have 4 major phases. Dr. Deasis mentioned primarily phase 1 and 2 trials that are going on in the Cancer Vaccine Institute. But I wanted to just, you know, talk about the different phases. So there is phase 1. Phase 1 is the first in-human clinical trial that really assesses the safety and gives us a clue of the effectiveness of the drug. That is not primarily what we're looking at in phase 1 trial. Predominantly, we're trying to figure out, is it safe and what dose should we move forward with? These are primarily small studies. So typically, less than 100 patients, anywhere from 20 to 50 patients at the most. And the trial can take several months to years to complete. And majority of the phase 1 trials go on to phase 2 trials. Phase 2 trials is where we really focus on the effectiveness of the drug, trying to figure out, well, is it working the way we hypothesized or anticipated in the disease that we're testing it in? And this phase of clinical trial is typically in anywhere from 20 to 30 to close to 100 or so patients. And this trial phase can also last a few years. Not a lot of drugs move from phase 2 to phase 3, probably less than a third or so. And phase 3 are really large trials. They're done at many institutes, kind of nationwide, sometimes even international trials if it's a rare disease. And there have been several clinical trials that are phase 3 that I've been a part of, and they're open literally at 100 to 200 centers across the world. And so that's what it takes. That's the kind of coordination it takes to conduct these clinical trials. There's a lot of oversight, and hundreds to thousands of patients participate in these trials. And they're typically randomized and blinded. So this way there's no bias introduced into interpreting the results. There are a lot of independent groups that help evaluate the results of the trial as well. And typically after phase 3 is what leads to FDA approval if the trial is successful. And phase 4 is what we consider post-marketing. So once the drug makes it to the market and it's being consumed by our patients, our consumers, then we look at post-marketing data such as safety, things, basically when drugs are being used in the real world, are we getting any additional safety indications or that help us further understand, when it's being used in a larger number of patients beyond phase 3, is the drug being equally effective, well tolerated, and all of those things are what we evaluate. So I wanted to talk about, why does diversity in clinical trials matter? I know this is really important to this group, and that's where we've gone, together today. But all of the studies that we just talked about, the clinical trials is what feeds information to the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, to decide whether a drug should be approved for the indication that it's been tested for. For example, if it's for stage 4 breast cancer, the FDA decides using the clinical trial data, should we move forward, with approval based on the safety and the effectiveness that has been studied in the clinical trial. We know that different people can respond differently to drugs. And that's why it's really important to have representation in clinical trials from, every walk of life. And we want the medicine to be tested in people whom it's going to be used in. And so far, we are not doing a very good job as a whole in representing diversity in clinical trials. This is data from the FDA, just to highlight for cancer clinical trials, only about 3% out of close to 7,000 plus patients were Black or African Americans in clinical trials. This is basically the same story for all people of color. All ethnicities and races are underrepresented in clinical trials and have been for decades. Obviously, the goal is to move the needle and understand these barriers, and so we can start making headways in this. Some of the barriers to clinical trial participation are access, awareness, racism, and workforce diversity. There are many solutions that the National Cancer Institute and various organizations have put forward, and we're hoping to implement some of these at the Cancer Vaccine Institute to continue to break down these barriers to increase our diversity in clinical trial participation. Access, there are many patients who travel from out of state, so travel itself can be a burden, and of course it comes with cost. Awareness, which is what we're hoping to do today, to bring about awareness of what clinical trials are and why they're important for cancer care. Unfortunately, in US history, there have been unethical experiments done in with the Tuskegee experiment, obviously being the most frightening in healthcare, and those things still live on in people's mind. And of course, that is one of the things that we need to continue to work on, to continue to build, trust, and trying to introduce clinical trials and research care in our conversations early on. And increasing workforce diversity is important, and hiring racially and ethnically diverse staff that's culturally competent in order to serve our diverse patient population. This is another sort of conundrum in how do you actually find clinical trials. So the best way is to talk to your oncologist. That is, the first person of contact typically for most patients. There can be, of course, referrals to other major academic centers or institutions that are in your area or out of state to consider. Part of the second opinions to many institutions is also to learn about clinical trials and can be a future point of contact that patients may benefit from. There are many national resources. One is clinicaltrials.gov that has all of the clinical trials listed across the country and even globally that are open internationally. The National Cancer Institute is another great website, and the American Society of Clinical Oncology has some information on clinical trials as well. There are some patient-friendly websites. For example, for breast cancer, there is a patient-friendly website with breast trials listed specifically, and there are others that exist for other diseases as well. This is one of the things that comes up fairly commonly, and that is how are our patients protected in clinical trials? So I wanted to highlight some of the things that come up commonly. One is participation in a clinical trial is always voluntary. You can go on a clinical trial and come off of a clinical trial at any point. It does not affect the standard of care treatment or does not affect your relationship with your oncologist in any way. And these are sort of windows of opportunities that, if with the right piece of information and comfort level, if you decide to participate, then it is voluntary and you can come off of a trial at any point. Safety is a huge priority. We have to follow very detailed instructions and protocols, and there are strict rules for safety in terms of stopping a drug or, reducing the dose of a drug and all that. An informed consent process is a key step in explaining the study before you join the trial. And that is typically done with your physician and a research coordinator, where they go over the pros and the cons of participating in the trial. And as part of that, also explain what other alternate treatments exist. So, in that context, whether clinical trial is the right next best step or not is something that's discussed as a whole. We take very important steps to keep all of our patients or volunteers' personal information as safe and protected as possible. And clinical trials are monitored by independent groups. There are institutional review boards. These trials are monitored throughout at different levels throughout the duration of the study. So why participate in addition to some of the things I already mentioned? With rare diseases, sometimes clinical trials are the best option. And of course, that depends on, what standard of care treatment exists for that disease or not. And when immunotherapy trials were coming about for lung cancer or melanoma, those were probably the best options, for patients, given the novelty of the treatment and the early responses that we were seeing with those drugs, which were extremely encouraging. So there's potential of treatment benefit to the individual with a novel investigational treatment, of course. And again, these are potential benefits. There's also potential benefit to future patients. And you can be part of helping improve upon what our standard treatments are. And as an individual, for example, someone living with metastatic cancer of any kind, you can increase the number of treatment options that are available by participating in clinical trials. And there is, because of all of the regulatory processes and the way the trials are conducted, there is typically high quality clinical care that someone receives on a clinical trial, with the medical team and also the research team closely monitoring you as the trials study is proceeding and your treatment is proceeding on the trial. There are some other considerations in terms of what's an appropriate time to participate in a clinical trial. My perspective as an oncologist is that clinical trials are sort of little windows of opportunity that open and close, and the standard treatments that are FDA approved always remain available. So if there are clinical trials available that can increase the number of treatment options, and if it makes sense, taking your whole health into account and where your disease is at in conversation with the oncologist, then a clinical trial could be a good option. There are common, sort of misconceptions that at least I've heard of from patient perspective, and that may not be true in all communities, but I hear a lot that, I'll wait for the clinical trial when I run out of standard of care options. And for the reason I just talked about, typically patients who get on clinical trials need to be in a somewhat healthier state because we're looking at new drugs and we are also assessing for safety. So patients at some point may be too ill to get on a clinical trial, and it's all due to the safety parameters that are built into the study. We consider clinical trials for our patients at really every step. when there is a change in treatment or if the cancer is not responding to the treatment that may be currently on. And there, as I mentioned earlier, there are several rigorous steps that need to be taken place before you can begin treatment on a trial. So there's a screening process prior to the study that includes, scans, blood work, could be EKG, looking at the heart, depending on what the drug is designed for, and what potential side effects the drug may have. And all of these, again, are to keep our patients as safe as possible on these trials. And I've listed a website, which is from the National Cancer Institute. I think this provides a lot of good information about clinical trials beyond what I'm talking about today as well. So in terms of our clinical trials at the Cancer Vaccine Institute, we have actually several participants from out of state who travel for the cancer vaccine. We have a team of research coordinators and clinical managers who partner with our community and academic oncologists to coordinate the cancer vaccine treatments for our patients. A lot of the cancer vaccines are given in addition to other treatments, for example, immunotherapy or chemotherapy, and partnering with other oncologists or the local team is a very important way to coordinate patients' care. Our goal is to increase diversity in our clinical trials, and Dr. Deese has already talked about various ongoing trials in breast, lung, and ovarian cancer currently. And, the idea today is to really open up a conversation, in terms of what would be helpful in increasing, diversity in not just our trials, but in cancer trials in general. I was recently at the University of Arizona, and there was a talk about having community ambassadors and some of the work that they're doing in increasing, diversity of clinical trial participants at their cancer center, and have had some success with that. We have thought about, having more social workers to help with some of the barriers that exist in terms of access. So there are several things that we can do to help improve our current state, which is, I would say, fairly dismal at this point in terms of racial and ethnic diversity. So why do we do what we do? I think as patients and as researchers, clinical trials give us all hope. We hope that we can improve on the cancer care that exists today and continue to evolve beyond that. And I think the future is bright. And I'm glad to be working with the Cancer Vaccine Institute on many studies currently. So thank you all for listening.
Very good. Thank you so much. So your screen, thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Vinayak. So we've heard about cancer vaccines from the researchers' perspectives. Now let us turn our attention to the patient for a patient and advocate perspective. Bridget Hempstead is the founder and CEO of Sierra Sisters, an organization that provides breast cancer support, education, and advocacy for African American women. Bridget's vision is to educate and empower women who experience disparities in access to health education and care due to cultural stereotypes and racial bias. At the time of her breast cancer diagnosis, there were few resources for Black women. Bridget is committed to change, and her work now extends to Black women and men with other cancers as well. In addition to joining the CVI Patient Advisory Council, Bridget and Sierra Sisters have also recently teamed up with an initiative at UW Medicine to interview Black women and identify their needs and barriers they may face, all in an effort to improve early detection of breast cancer. Let us now hear from Bridget Hempstead.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Let's see, here we go. Thank you so much for the introduction and also the invitation to be able to be here with you today. I'll just share a little bit of my story before going into the vaccine that I received as a clinical trial. I was diagnosed in 1996 on my 35th birthday. Prior to me being diagnosed, my doctor told me that I really didn't need a mammogram, gave me a myriad of reasons why I didn't. And then the last reason was, you're a Black woman and you don't need to get screened for breast cancer, come back in 10 years. Well, that was the beginning of the advocacy concerning breast cancer. And I demanded a mammogram. Upon that mammogram, that's when they found out that I did have breast cancer. The same doctor called and apologized. And she said, the reason why I wasn't going to give you a mammogram is because this is what we were taught in school. And so she said, because of this, I'm changing my whole practice. But it's unfortunate that we still have to continue to fight as Black women to make sure that we are seen as a person and that our concerns are very serious and they need to listen to it. So I'll fast forward to 2015. I was diagnosed again 18 years later with metastatic breast cancer. And advocacy when it comes to our health has to happen almost every day, daily, especially for the Black woman. Making sure that our doctors are listening to us. We're no longer saying that whatever the doctor says, we're going to do it. Now we know that there's options available and you are the captain of the team. Well, when I was diagnosed with metastatic, my first doctor told me, well, you're not going to live a year. That was 9 years ago. And she also said, I will not allow you to go into a clinical trial. And she refused to sign the documents so that I can go into a clinical trial when I asked her about it. So I have to tell you, I removed her from my team because it is my medical team that I'm putting together. And I replaced her with an incredible oncologist. She signed the paperwork, and then I was able to enroll in Dr. Desis's clinical trial. And that was in 2015. So I must say that the barriers that happens when it comes down to advocating and fighting for what's right for us, what's available is very serious. Because if you have a doctor that's not going to tell you about a clinical trial, then we have a problem. If you have a doctor that says, I'm not going to allow you to go into a clinical trial, we have a problem. And so I know that you are all brilliant women and men that are, I think just women that are on this call. You've got to advocate for yourself and for your loved ones. Why is that so important? Because we are dealing with racism. We're dealing with access, but we're also dealing with the fact that maybe our lives are not as valuable as others, and they are. So we're encouraging our young Black people to become doctors, researchers, clinicians, and then also the wraparound services that need to happen for us. So this is from the eyes of a survivor. I know that there's probably questions that many of us have to say. I could say so much more, but I want to give room to questions and answers and also the space to these wonderful women that I'm here presenting with. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Bridget. And I do want to remind everyone to put questions in the chat because we're going to look for them so that we can get answers for you. So with all this research and scholarship and perspective, I think we see the value in the great pioneering work that is being done. I think we also know from experience that creating something of value is an essential beginning, but we also need to have a means to make things happen. And that is the purview of the implementer in charge. At CVI, that person is Dr. Kieran Dillon, the executive director. Dr. Dillon earned a Bachelor of Science in Biology from Western Washington University in Bellingham, Washington. She then completed her PhD in genetics at the University of Washington, where she studied the in vivo functions of the Werner syndrome protein. She completed her postdoctoral training at Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center, calling it Fred Hutch, where she studied the genetics and genomics of chemotherapy resistance in BRCA-associated breast and ovarian cancers. While at Fred Hutch, she also co-founded Hutch United, an organization that promotes the success and retention of underrepresented and other minorities in the sciences. She joined the Rivkin Center for Ovarian Cancer as Director of Scientific Programs to oversee an international grants program, symposia, scientific communications, and ovarian and breast cancer education, and to participate in donor relations. As Executive Director of CVI, Dr. Dillon manages, plans, and directs research opportunities and operations. To provide an additional perspective and to discuss with us ways of staying connected, please now receive Dr. Kieran Dillon.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. Give me a moment to just share my slides as well. Let's put that into, oh yeah. So I am so thankful for all of you for giving up time on your evening. Many of you, I think, in the Central and Eastern time zones on behalf of all of us at the Cancer Vaccine Institute. And I'll be sharing a few ways that you can stay connected both with us and with the Sierra Sisters as well. But first, I want to take a moment to thank the hard work that was put in by maybe three of my favorite sisters outside of my own family, Dr. Ramonda Johnson, Marilyn Lacey, and Gloria Ann Jackson, through their work with the Akarama Foundation and the Monarch Awards in really helping us connect with the community so that we can solve some of these very difficult problems that we all face. And I also want to take a moment to thank Bridget for sharing her story and for serving on our Patient Advisory Council, which we really value a lot in the work that she's doing with Sierra Sisters. Bridget's going to continue this work at a patient event we're having later this month called the CVI Circle. So the work never stops. It really has been a pleasure to put this together with all of you. So, you know, as you've heard from several folks, we had a few specific goals for this evening that I hope we're able to reach. And you heard from Dr. Desis about cancer vaccines. Hopefully now you all know that cancer vaccines are a thing, cancer vaccines exist, and we believe that they will have a significant impact on human health through the treatment and prevention of cancer. You heard from Dr. Vinayak on the importance of clinical trials and why participation is important from all communities, especially Black communities of African Americans, of immigrants, every other community that experiences health disparities. And I hope that you will all hear, you heard from Bridget on really that we have to be our own advocates. And I hope that you feel even more empowered in your own health journeys with some of the information that you've learned. And as Gloria Ann asked you earlier as well, please share what you've learned today with others as well. So, why do we all care so much about all of this, right? So cancer is really personal. It can affect anyone. This photo that you see is me at the age of 37, having what was left of my hair being removed when it started to fall out 3 weeks into chemotherapy treatment to treat breast cancer that I had been diagnosed with. Because it can affect anyone, I think we all agree, we all have the right to have access to the best healthcare. And that includes cutting edge, potentially life-saving therapies, such as cancer vaccines as well. And as we heard today, it's so important that the treatments that we receive as patients are based on studies that included people who might have similar genetics to us, who might have similar lifestyles that reflect us as well. And this is why we're all working hard towards this goal of increasing diversity. So I encourage you all to learn more. Please take out your cell phone, take a photo. There's a lot of information on this slide. Our website is listed here, both for the Cancer Vaccine Institute and for Sierra Sisters. I encourage you to visit both. I've also listed email addresses. If you want to learn more, we're always happy to talk. We are really genuinely, authentically very interested in engaging with the community and really getting the word out about this. So please feel free to check out the websites and reach out on through email as well. And then a final way that you can stay connected is you can take a short survey. If you have cell phones, you can use the camera of your cell phone and to scan this QR code, which will take you to a survey with about 5 or 6 questions. You can let us know what you think of today's program. But you can also sign up to receive a newsletter or other updates and stay connected with research from the Cancer Vaccine Institute and activities of Sierra Sisters. Even if you choose not to sign up for the updates, Dr. Johnson, Marilyn, and Glorianne have asked for everyone to participate in this so that they also know what is the reach of this type of programming. And you can also leave other comments, including if there are other programs that you might be interested in participating in. So with that, I will thank you all again for spending your evening with us, and I'll pass it on to Dr. Johnson and we'll take questions. So please do put those questions in the QA box. I think we already have a couple.
All right.
I'll stop.
Cool.
Oops.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate everything that has been said. So I will just start off with this. Well, I'm going to ask each of us panelists to just, interrupt and speak out a question that you see in the chat. And I'm going to start off with the question of my own, and I don't know who would want to answer this, maybe Dr. Desis, but what is triple negative cancer? That is a term that I have heard a couple of times, but I don't actually know what it is. Anyone?
Triple negative breast cancer is defined as a breast cancer that does not express hormone receptors. So it's negative for estrogen and progesterone receptor, and it does not express the HER2 protein. So we kind of break down breast cancers roughly into 3 types. Those that have hormone receptors, they can be treated with anti-hormone therapy. HER2 positive breast cancers, they can be treated with HER2 directed therapy. And then the triple negative breast cancers, they don't have any of those receptors on them.
I see. All right. Thank you very much. Are there questions in the chat?
Yes, there's a question from Adrian in Chicago asking, where are you in terms of clinical trials for cervical cancer?
We are not studying cervical cancer vaccines at this point because they are directed against a well-defined antigen, human papillomavirus. And there are many, many vaccines out there that may appear to be effective. However, we have a very close collaboration with a company that has a quite an exciting vaccine that's encoded in a special type of DNA. And our collaborator at the CVI, Dr. John Liao, will be starting a clinical trial for cervical cancer in the very near future, I think within the next 4 to 5 months. So if you go on our website and look for John's email address, he'd be able to give you more information.
Thank you.
Another question? Are there other
Yeah,
questions?
there are other questions. There's a question about lung cancer. Where are the studies on lung cancer? Nora, would you like to take that?
Sure. We're using our StemVac vaccine for lung cancer. We've got a randomized phase 2 study ongoing right now, but we are making vaccines directed against specific types of lung cancers that are still in the preclinical stage. One vaccine is directed against squamous cell lung cancer, and the other one is directed against a type of non-small cell lung cancer, which is more of a histology that comes up in people who don't smoke. So those two vaccines are still in mouse studies, so to speak.
Okay.
And we have a question, will copies of the slides be available? So this is being recorded and we'll be sure to share the link so people can have access to that. Another question, a very practical question. If one wants to participate in a trial that may be out of state, are financial resources available for travel, lodging, etc.? So generally, Shweta, did you want to take that one?
Yeah. So I think, Karen, you were going to say generally, but yes, generally, there is some support from the sponsors or the companies that are sponsoring the trial or paying for the cost of the study or the drug. They do allow some travel reimbursement. So there are some financial resources available, but it really does sort of depend on the study.
Okay.
Another question is there a data bank of clinical trials and locations?
So for the Cancer Vaccine Institute clinical trials, they're all being done at University of Washington. And the data bank or all of the clinical trials are listed on the Cancer Vaccine Institute's website that Karen showed and Dr. Deese's slides had as well. And I'm sure it's going to be part of the recording. But if the question is about general clinical trials, the clinicaltrials.gov website that I had in my slides has information about various clinical trials, depending on what disease that we're looking for. For example, if it's breast cancer, there's usually a place where you can type in a keyword. If there's a specific drug that you're looking for, you can type in that keyword. And there are all of the locations listed on that web page at the bottom of the page typically. So it tells you, well, this clinical trial is open in Washington State and New York, and it gives you the exact centers where the trial is open, and also has contact information, a phone number and an email for the person you can reach out to learn more about that study. And I thought maybe Bridget can weigh in, from patient perspective. What did you find, Bridget, to be most helpful in finding clinical trials? Are there things that you thought, helped you through your journey?
Well, one of the things is equipped in our community with questions to ask your doctor. because a lot of times your oncologists do know about clinical trials, and maybe you guys have not engaged in that type of conversation. And I think right away it's very important to talk about your treatment options and also clinical trials. Now, it may be the clinical trials are not a fit for you now, but at least you'll have that in your toolkit to understand that maybe later on I may need a clinical trial. So it's everything to have the knowledge, ask the questions. I wouldn't stay on Google. I would go on trusted websites to look for clinical trials so that you're not going to get mixed messages. And also, when enrolling in clinical trials, you want to be sure that if you're enrolling in a clinical trial, that it's for the type of cancer that you have.
Yeah, I would echo what Bridget is saying in terms of, advocating for yourself. So if your oncologist hasn't brought up clinical trials, it's definitely okay, more than okay, to bring it up yourself and ask about those resources at the institution.
Yes. And it's also important to get a second and maybe a third opinion as well.
Mhm.
And that way you can collect this information to make an informed decision as a patient.
So it looks like there's one more question. Any clinical trials or vaccines on pancreatic cancer? Nora, do you want to take that?
Yeah, there are several clinical trials on pancreatic cancer. They're not being done here at the University of Washington. Most of them are being done on the East Coast. And the easiest way to find those are to, again, go to that website, www.clinicaltrials.gov. And if you just type in vaccines and then the second word pancreatic cancer, it will give you at least 20 to choose from.
Very good. Very good. So are there any other questions in the chat at this point?
Yes, there's one more question that just came up. And that is, what percentage of breast cancer survivors have recurrence amongst African American women? And what precursors should one look into when researching various clinical trials?
Do you want to take that one, Shweta?
So one of the things, we think about, for example, in triple negative breast cancer, I know that came up, and there is a higher risk of developing triple negative breast cancer among Black or African American women and Hispanic women as well. So one of the things that we look for is how sensitive was the triple negative breast cancer when treated in early stage setting to the chemotherapy. So we usually give, chemotherapy prior to patients going to surgery. And if the cancer was really sensitive to chemotherapy, and patients get what we call a complete response by the time they go to surgery, for example, all of the cancer has melted away, that's really good news. That helps us, figure out that, okay, this cancer has a very, very, very low likelihood of coming back. But one of the other things that we look for is if the triple negative breast cancer was not as sensitive to chemotherapy and there was still a lot left at the time of surgery, then, those women have a higher risk of the cancer coming back. So there are a lot of conversations that happen with the oncologist through the treatment process in terms of, how did my cancer respond to the treatment that I was given? And when you go to surgery, what is the risk of it coming back? And that's based on different sort of variables, different calculators that we can use to provide you with that information. And as Dr. Desis mentioned, we do have clinical trial with a vaccine, the StemVac vaccine, specifically in that patient population where we think that you may be at a higher risk for the cancer coming back. And the idea behind using the vaccine is to target some of those resistant cancer cells that may have been left behind, and to try to get rid of those to reduce the risk of cancer recurrence. So there are many biological factors that go into that conversation of, identifying your risk for recurrence. So I'm just giving one example with triple negative breast cancer, but there are, several other ways to assess that for HER2 positive breast cancer and also the hormone positive breast cancer.
Another question.
There are a couple of more questions and a comment. Question, are there age restrictions to participate in the clinical trials?
We generally do not have any upper limit of age restriction. We've immunized patients as old as, I think, 88 was our oldest patient. There are age restrictions at the lower end. We cannot enroll pediatric patients on our clinical trials. And I think that is defined as 14 and below. So we generally have to limit it at age 14.
Okay. And are the vaccines used in the various clinical trials approved by the FDA?
None of the vaccines I talked about today are approved by the FDA. There are 3 approved vaccines for cancer. 2 of them are to prevent cancer. The HPV vaccine prevents cervical cancer. The HBV vaccine, hepatitis B vaccine, prevents liver cancer. And there is a prostate cancer vaccine called Provenge that has been approved in men who have castration-resistant prostate cancer. So those are the only 3 vaccines that are currently approved for cancer.
Okay, and this next is a comment, not a question, just a thank you for all of you inspiring panelists. You are very much appreciated for this most informative and hope-giving webinar. Again, thank you.
So that might just be the perfect cue as we wind down to the end of our time. To the panelists, does anybody have any final comments that you want to make? Anyone?
I do. I want to address the FDA. So, if I'm correct here, a FDA-approved drug is, once it's done with the clinical trial, there's a process before being approved as a mainstream treatment option. So I don't want people to get confused that a clinical trial is automatically FDA approved, because there's a process that has to happen before it gets into the mainstream. So that means that when it is FDA approved, then it is available for mainstream treatment options.
And that's a good point, Bridget. It's important to know that all clinical trials are FDA regulated. So we hope to get to the point where the vaccines are approved, but the FDA is involved at the very beginning. So they're watching.
Very good. Any other comments from the panelists?
So I wonder if I may just share my screen, because I think Lorianne had said that the QR code wasn't visible. So I'll put this up for just another moment for anyone to take a photo with their phone, if they would like to do that.
Okay. Well, while you are doing that, I am going to go ahead because we are actually approaching 7:30. Thank you to our panelists so much for all of this wonderful information, and to our participants. On behalf of Dr. Desis, Dr. Vinayak, Bridget Hemstead, Dr. Dillon of the Cancer Vaccine Institute and Sierra Sisters, the Monarch Awards Foundation Incorporated, the Akarama Foundation Incorporated, my sisters, Glorianne and Marilyn, and my son, Teddy. I want to express our appreciation for this opportunity to be of service and to have played some part in all the good that will be the result from this event. This is the conclusion of the webinar. I wish you all good health and good evening. Take care.
Good
Thank you
night.
so much.
Thank you
Bye
so much.
now.